Thanks for meeting us.
Good to be with you.
What happened after the hearing, it actually divided the Chinese community into two groups of people. One insists you are racist, especially the Chinese people. The second one, they actually said that you did a good thing for the Chinese community. What do you think?
Well, I believe that the right thing was done in asking one group of witnesses, and let's keep in mind there were 3 groups of witnesses of Chinese ethnicity that came before the committee.
The same day?
On the same day.
Same day.
I only asked one group a question as to their support or otherwise of the communist dictatorship in China. Why did I ask that group? They presented as academia, think tank people, as thought leaders within their community. And I thought it appropriate to test with them that which I had been told by so many of the Chinese diaspora in Australia, that the thought leaders had been influenced in a way that they were not willing to condemn the dictatorship. Keeping in mind this is a dictatorship that has, as we speak, 1 million Uyghurs in a concentration camp, crushing the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. They have prisoners of conscience, be it house Christians, Falun Gong, Buddhists, the Dalai Lama. You talk about Tibet, you talk about the South Sea Islands, and so the list goes on. It is a regime that is unfortunately brutal and has no regard for human rights.
Okay, so you think that anyone to do with policy making, you gotta state that position clearly.
I believe that those leaders, because the Chinese diaspora had told me that they were too scared to speak out because of the interference by the Chinese dictatorship, not only in Australia, but then with their relatives back home. And that was having a stifling effect, a chilling effect, on them fully engaging in Australia and Australian democracy. And so if the thought leaders, or those that were promoted as thought leaders in the public eye, were unwilling to condemn this brutal regime, then that confirmed to me that which the Chinese diaspora had been telling me, that there was a vacuum in the leadership in this space.
In the hearing, you said that you had no problem at all condemning Nazi because you were born in Germany. You had no problem condemning that. But the natural counter-argument would be, because Nazi is not here anymore. There's no Nazi at all, so it's free for everyone to condemn Nazi. But right now, CCP is at power. Is it a bit unfair to compare these two?
It is absolutely not unfair, and being of German extraction, I would like to think that German people are decent. But they were submitted to a brutal, ugly regime under Hitler.
But the regime is not here anymore.
No, but how did that happen? Because too many good, decent people who knew better were not willing to stand up and speak against the brutality of fascism. Similarly, I think today we see in China a brutal regime that too many people are unwilling to condemn, and as a result they get away with putting 1 million people. Just imagine the human tragedy, the human trauma of 1 million people being in a concentration camp, of prisoners of conscience, the people that are now in prison simply because they support democracy in Hong Kong. Unless good people speak out against that regime, their brutality will continue and get worse. And that is why men and women of good faith need to speak up, have the courage, call out this regime for what it is. And I was disappointed that some of the witnesses were not willing to do so.
Yeah, these opinion leaders in the community, they might say, okay, if I condemn CCP, it will be harder for me to do some kind of interaction with China, with the Chinese government, so that they can maybe earn interest for the Australian people. I can condemn that, but if I condemn them, then it will be impossible for me to connect to those people influenced by the Chinese government.
Edgar, I can hear that point of view, and if that was their honest view and belief, having failed to condemn the regime, they would then not have immediately turned around and got the CCP playbook out and condemned me as a racist. That is what concerns me. If they were a fear, and they know that this can occur with Senate committees, you can give your evidence in private, in confidence. And one group of Chinese...
In private?
Yes,
in
private.
Public, you get like a submit material, so they can't say that in public, but...
Yes, and they were aware of that capacity, and one group of Chinese witnesses actually did ask for confidentiality for exactly that reason.
So that kind of interaction is normal?
Yes, and that was open to them. And if they would have asked for that, of course it would have been granted. Look, I don't want to cause difficulty to anybody, but what I do want to cause is liberation for the 1 million in a concentration camp, to the prisoners of conscience, to the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And so, all that said, if I'm called a racist just because I'm on the side of the Uyghurs, of the House Christians, of Falun Gong, of the pro-democracy movement, well, I'll cop that tag, because I'm more than happy to have slurs thrown against me because I'm supporting the freedom and liberty and the human rights, basic human rights, that should be afforded to every single human being on this earth, irrespective of their race, colour, ethnicity, religion, sex, no matter what. And I'm on their side. As a Liberal, I support freedom, individual rights, and I stand against the autocracy, be it a fascism or communism. And today, I don't think we have any actual fascist regimes. Stand to be corrected, but the one big threat at the moment, especially in our region, is a communist dictatorship that rips up international agreements, UN-sanctioned international agreement, the Sino-UK agreement in relation to Hong Kong, ripped up, pro-democracy crushed. They, in their National Congress, they have a motion each time about the reunification of China. This time round, the word peaceful was taken out of the resolution because freedom-loving people around the world noticed this and condemned China, the Chinese dictatorship for it. They've now put back the word peaceful. What that shows me is they do listen to criticism, and that is why we need more men and women of courage to stand up for freedom and call out the dictatorship for what it is. It is brutal, it is undemocratic, it has no regard for human rights, and I, for one, would seek to champion human rights.
Would you ask any Chinese people to condemn CCP?
No, and I have not done that with my interaction, even with you, Edgar. I have not asked you. I have not asked...
Because you don't need to. You don't need to. You know my YouTube videos.
But the only people that I've asked it of are those that appeared before the committee as academic think tank leaders, and might I add, I also knew the antecedents of some of them. Like one of them has a Twitter handle, Red Rabble. What do you think that tells you about their political stand? Another one comes from the Victorian Labor Party. The Victorian Labor Party boasts Senator Kim Carr, who has been promoted in CCP propaganda films in China. And so, when you've got those sort of antecedents and present to the committee as academic think tank leaders, I think you are entitled to ask, where do they stand on that fundamental issue of human rights in China? And the brutality of that regime cannot be overcome simply by labelling the person asking the questions a racist. We need more substance than that. It is very hollow, it's very shallow, and it's straight out of the CCP playbook to, when you're asked a difficult question, label the person as a racist, and that way you can sidestep the issue.
Cheap shot, huh?
Very cheap shot. And look, I said at the hearing, and I'll say it again if need be, because I say it in every interview, we have to differentiate between the Chinese people and the brutal dictatorship under which they suffer. And I would have thought that people that are out there as thought leaders would be able to come out unequivocally and say, yes, we do condemn this brutal regime.
And I understand your position, but one of the concerns raised by my subscribers is that if you as a senator ask the witnesses to condemn the CCP, would that make any people in Australian society to maybe confront random Chinese people on the street, like do you support CCP, or do you condemn CCP, like that kind of thing?
I hope that doesn't happen, and it should not happen. You don't walk down the street asking a person that looks Italian, are you part of the mafia, or if you're Vietnamese, are you part of a triad, or whatever else. That, I think, the common decency within Australia dictates against that sort of behaviour.
Would you condemn if someone do that?
Oh, yes, yes. And there is no role for that. But when you are looking at how the diaspora within Australia are being able to intertwine themselves with Australian democracy, Australian freedoms, Australian liberties, our desire to integrate everybody in the greater multicultural Australian society, and you hear that there are thought leaders within a particular diaspora that are part and parcel of assisting the regime, and that regime needs to be condemned, I think it's appropriate to ask that question. As I said before, there were 3 groups of witnesses of Chinese ethnicity. I didn't ask all 3 of them that question, just the one. And look, if that has had the impact that some Australians then think it's appropriate to ask every Chinese person they meet, do you support the dictatorship or not, that would be most regrettable. And clearly anybody that knows me would know that that was never my purpose, never my intention, and quite frankly I doubt it will be the consequence, because what this does, this sort of suggestion, Edgar, and I know you're just putting it to me to get a response, is to try to put me on the back foot, rather than me seeking to champion the cause of the Uyghurs, the House Christians, the Falun Gong, the pro-democracy people, to put me on the back foot and thus not require that brutal dictatorship to give an account of themselves and for them to be called out for what they are, and they are brutal. When President Xi Jinping tells the world that the greatest thought leader ever was Karl Marx, that he would seek to model himself on the leadership of Stalin, the world should be alert that it has a problem on its hands, and we have to call it out for what it is. And so that is what I seek to do, and as a Liberal I stand against the autocracy of fascism and communists, any dictatorship, because I believe that within every being, human being, beats the heart of liberty, of freedom, of human rights. And it doesn't matter what your colour is, what your sex, whatever, everybody wants that freedom and liberty. That is what I seek to champion. And so it stands to reason if I champion that, I have to oppose dictatorships that seek to restrict those basic fundamental human rights that some people say they are God-given human rights, others say they are in the Universal Declaration. Wherever they come from, I think we can understand and know what the basic human rights are. Freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom to be able to go about your business.
Do you think that's your top priorities in terms of politics?
I think it has to be a top priority, because unless you are committed to the basics of freedoms for individuals, you then allow dictatorship to creep in and suppression of the people. And my view is that the greater the freedoms, the better the society is, and ultimately government should be the expression of the view of the people. It's not that the people should be the expression of the government.
Necessary evil.
Yes,
like
yes.
some kind of necessary evil. So you mentioned about your German background in the hearing. A lot of people are very interested in that. So can you tell us more about it?
Look, I was born in Germany, had the great privilege of coming to Australia at the age of 3.
At what year? In what year?
Yeah, 1961. So at the end of the post-war migration from Europe, my father got a job with the Hydroelectric Commission in the state of Tasmania. I've been there ever since. Best decision my parents could ever have made, and greatly blessed to have been able to be in Tasmania, grow up in Tasmania, and it's a wonderful indication, I think, of the warmth and embrace of the Australian people to allow a migrant like myself from a non-English speaking background to be elected by the people and rise to become, as I was, leader of the government in the Senate. This is a celebration of what Australia is, and I was very fortunate to be an expression of that by having been given the privilege of serving as leader in the Senate. And so that German background also tells me that good people, and I believe German people are fundamentally good people, like Chinese, like every other race, but they allowed themselves to succumb to an evil dictatorship. The history lesson is there for all of us to see. And the reason why Hitler was able to come to power was too many good Germans cast a blind eye towards the ugly side of his leadership, of his political movement, and then the ugly side grew and grew and grew and grew.
Because of what? Why did they let that happen?
Because
intimidation?
Because too many good people were not willing to call it out at the beginning. And that is what has to happen. And look, China, I think, was on the road to liberalisation. There were freedoms starting to develop. But when President Xi Jinping became president, he went around the world. He came to my state on a charm offensive. And I must say, I was very hopeful that the Chinese dictatorship would liberate more and more. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping has doubled down on extreme Marxism, and that is a threat to freedom-loving people of the world. And what's more, it is an abuse of the human rights of millions of Chinese people. And if we don't speak up for them in the free world, who will?
You said you were called Nazi all the time. All the time. When did that happen?
Oh, look, from time to time at school, but it's even happened in the Senate chamber where some Labor senators, not recently, but in the past when I first got there.
I asked Colonel Klink on the other side moments earlier a very specific question.
After likening Senator Eric Abetz to the fictional Hogan's Heroes Nazi, Senator Dastyari later withdrew the comments. Just the latest in a long string of attacks on Senator Abetz's family history.
Those sort of interjections were made, and you know what? I thought how sad of them to be making such calls. I thought it reflected badly on them.
I mean, why did they start that? Like, because of the difference between your political opinions?
Oh, look, I think you become a very cheap target if you happen to be a conservative and believe in the fundamental freedoms, and you're a conservative, and you happen to be of a German background. It's a very easy thing.
Nazi is not about conservatism. Nazi is about fascism.
Of course it is. Of course it is.
Are they saying that fascism equals to conservatism?
Too many of the left are willing to call people like myself extreme right, when if you are...
I was called that.
If I'm called extreme right, what would you then call Adolf Hitler? And that is where the language has just become ridiculous within our political discourse. And I am from the centre-right political party, the Liberal Party. That is where I found my political roots, been there for over 40 years, because I'm committed to those 17 statements that the founder of the Liberal Party, Robert Menzies, set out in a document called We Believe. That's what I'm committed to. And that's what I invite everybody else who joins the Liberal Party. Can you sign up to these principles? If you can, you ought to be in the Liberal Party. Now, for people then to try to say that somebody that seeks to champion the cause of pro-democracy in Hong Kong against concentration camps is somehow an extreme right-winger, I don't get it. But yet again, this is what happens too often, that the left will cast a slur, make an allegation, and then hope you spend time defending yourself, because whilst you're doing that, you are not exposing the evils of the extreme left of the Marxist dictatorship in China. And I just find that very disappointing, because there was a time in Australian politics where the Liberal Party and the Labor Party were united in their condemnation of fascism and communism. And now it seems that elements within the Labor Party find it exceptionally difficult to condemn the Marxist regime dictatorship in China.
Okay. Can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
So you were called Nazis when you were in your school. You were very young, right?
Oh, look, not too often, and it's one of those sort of unthinking slurs that children make against each other. Was it pleasant? No, it wasn't. Do you get over it? Yes, you do. Do you keep on in life? Yes, you do. You look back on it and say unpleasant. Chances are the people that said it at the time did say unthinkingly, didn't realise what they were actually saying.
This is actually one of the main concerns of the Chinese community. I'm the president of a friend whose child was called coronavirus. It was shouted coronavirus in school. Like there are two ways of dealing with these kind of things. One is just suck it up and live it. Just live with it. Pretend it's never happened. The second one would be like just call out every time you think it's racism. What would you do? What did you do?
Look, I think I mainly sucked it up and just kept on with my life and thought, well, if that's what you think, that's your problem, not mine. I would like to think that teachers and the community nowadays are a bit more attuned to these things, and so if a child does say to another child of Chinese ethnicity, coronavirus, one would hope that the teacher would intervene and say, that is highly inappropriate, you ought to apologise and hopefully call it out, and it doesn't happen.
So parents should go to the teachers and the teacher will teacher deal with this stuff.
Yes. I believe that is more than appropriate for that to happen, or to stamp that sort of ugly behaviour out. And look, children can often be very cruel to each other without really realising or thinking about what they're doing, and that is where the role model of mum and dad and of teachers is so important, to say to them and make them think about what they've said. Is it fair? Is it reasonable? How would you feel if you were of Chinese ethnicity and somebody said that to you? Is a child in Australia responsible for the coronavirus? On any objective analysis, the answer is an overwhelming no. So it's a ridiculous assertion to make, and if a child makes that assertion to another child, that child should be quietly taken aside. Think about it. What have you said? Why have you said it? Does it make sense? Is it hurtful? And why don't you go and apologise?
That reminds me of one of my close friends. He asked me a question like, if you think, because in the hearing, you said that you were called Nazis, which is not pleasant, right? And then why, if this is not pleasant to you, why would you apply the similar thing to those three witnesses?
I did not apply that to them, right? Did I call them communists? No, I didn't. I asked them, well, first of all, the context of why I asked, one of the witnesses put in a written submission which started off that Australian politics is too white. In other words, concentrating on the divisiveness of identity politics. And so I quoted Martin Luther King to them, that Martin Luther King, that great civil rights leader, was not interested in skin colour, was not interested in ethnicity. What was he interested in? content of character. In other words, values and beliefs. Values and beliefs. And I made that very clear. And the witness struggled with that. And I then said, yeah, values and beliefs ultimately are what's the most important. And I then asked, are you able to condemn the Chinese communist dictatorship? And they struggled again with condemning it. So it wasn't that I said, you're Chinese, you must be communist, do you condemn? No, it started off with identity politics, but also knowing that this person has a Twitter handle of Red Rabble, works for a left-wing think tank, etc. And given that he was promoting himself as a thought leader within the Chinese diaspora, I just thought I would test, as I said before, I would test with him as to the views of the dictatorship, given that a lot of the diaspora are too scared to speak out. And, well, the answers there on the hands are, interestingly, might I say, that in all the media commentary, all the press releases, the only person that quoted the Hansard was myself. So the actual words spoken, I'm more than willing to stand by. But what people have said was that I demanded a loyalty test. I have defied everybody to go through the Hansard and see where I said that. It does not appear. And Edgar, this is the serious thing. The journalists just swallow up the narrative that, as I said before, comes straight out of the CCP playbook, which is tough questions, label the person a racist, or assert that he said you have to renounce the Communist Party, as though I asserted they were members. Never said anything like that. Did I ask them for loyalty? No, I did not. And so you set up the straw man argument and hope people concentrate on that rather than the real issue. And I come back to this, Edgar, and it's very important. Whose side do you think the 1 million Uyghurs are on in this debate? I think they might be on my side. What about the pro-democracy people in Hong Kong? I suspect they're on my side in this debate. What about the house Christians, the Falun Gong? I suspect they're on my side and are quietly thankful that there is somebody willing to call out this brutal regime for what it is and fighting for the exposure, because with that exposure, with that pressure from around the world, hopefully the dictatorship will realise that they do have to provide basic human rights to their citizens.
So, CCP aside, what do you think about Chinese people in Australia as a community?
Oh, Chinese people are a wonderful people. They've made a wonderful contribution in my home state of Tasmania. They came over for, first of all, for tin mining, especially in the northeast. And Tasmania, in fact, has a good record in relation to the Chinese community, whereas on the mainland, the rest of Australia, they were not so good to the Chinese people, and there were racist and other attacks against Chinese in the early days of the gold mines, etc. And then some of them remained in Tasmania in the market garden, restaurant sectors, and have been part and parcel of the Tasmanian community now for generations. And for a while, I was neighbours with a Chinese market garden in Kingston where I lived. And wonderful people. And what I like, I know what I like about the Chinese community in Tasmania, at least, that I interact with the most: commitment to family, commitment to hard work, commitment to self-reliance. They're all the sort of values that I identify with as well. And so I think they've made a wonderful contribution to our social and economic well-being.
I understand that you support a merit-based political system, but do you think there is some kind of underrepresentation of the Chinese community? Because we have 1.2 million people in Australia, 5% of the whole population. But right now we have one federal MP, one only. So do you do you think there is? I'm not saying that it's an issue, but do you think there is under-representation of the community?
Look, as a community, and you can slice and dice the Australian community, male, female, young, old, ethnic, on ethnic grounds as well. But we had Senator Bill O'Chee in the past. We've had Senator Bin Chen from Victoria as well. So there have been Chinese representatives in our parliament. Would it be nice to see more? Yes. What is one of the things stifling their involvement? And that is what I was exploring at this Senate hearing. Why is it that so many in the diaspora are not willing to put up their hand and be actively involved? It is because of the insidious interference by Beijing in Australia, and if they are active in Australia, in a manner that is not acceptable to the dictatorship, then their relatives back home suffer consequences. As a result, they want to lie low in Australia. And I think I was able to expose that to a certain extent, because I want to see every single Australian. And when I say Australian, I don't care what they look like. I don't care if they're male or female. When they arrived in Australia, every Australian should be able to freely exercise all the wonderful freedoms, democratic freedoms that we have in this country.
Do you support any kind of like a equity-based assistance to raise you up to a certain point so that you can...
Look, if you have positive discrimination, it means, as of necessity, that somebody is being negatively discriminated against. And that is why the only way you can have a truly fair, equal society is to have it based on meritocracy. So, for example, myself, as a non-English speaking background person from Tasmania, being in the Senate, as Senate government leader, I was overrepresenting that cohort of the Tasmanian and then Australian community by being leader of the government in the Senate. One of the top positions in the country and clearly overrepresented. But because I'm a Conservative, the media would never celebrate that. And that's one of those things. But look, if you or I needed a lawyer, an accountant, a brain surgeon, would our first question be, well, let's make it brain surgery. Are they German? Are they Chinese? Are they male? Are they female? Are they young? Are they old? No, we want one test. Are they the best person to deal with my brain tumour? Same with running a country. Same with a lawyer. You want the best person for the job. And when you have social inclusion as your only guide, you end up with a disaster of Premier Dan Andrews in Victoria with the security firm that was asked to look after the COVID people in the hotels. They weren't concerned about capacity, they weren't concerned about security, they weren't concerned about keeping the other people safe. Their only concern seems to have been social inclusion. What a disaster that was.
Yeah, for brain surgery, I definitely want the best one. But for a psychologist, maybe I will go for a Chinese one who can speak Mandarin.
Oh, look, and that makes very good sense, that if that is your need, that you have somebody that understands your culture, your background, your way of thinking, and I can understand
language
that.
Skill is a merit, actually.
Oh, yes, but if you had somebody of a different ethnicity who had excellent Mandarin skills, and that was the only concern, the language, then would it be of a concern to you whether they were of Chinese ethnicity or not? It's the capacity to speak the language and understand the language that is the test. And so I always argue meritocracy, because if you say that somebody who's, let's say, got 90% in an exam shouldn't be allowed to continue on in favour of somebody that only got 60% in the exam because they happen to be of German origin, But what about the person that got 90% being left behind, not being allowed to move on? For one reason, they're of the wrong ethnicity. That is not fair, that is not just, and it dumbs down society. And can I say, what we need is meritocracy, and what we need is equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes.
What brought you to Sydney today?
I came to Sydney for the CPAC conference, which is a conservative talk fest, if you like, and I was able to make a contribution as part of a panel discussing international affairs, China, the United States elections, of course, the international affairs, but I also came to Sydney to be part of a commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. I'm the chair of the Australian-Israeli Parliamentary Friendship Group. I've been the chair of that for a number of years, and it was sad to see an Israeli Prime Minister who had helped deliver the Oslo Accords being gunned down by a fellow countryman, a fellow Jew, because of extremism within his own country. But the thing that really attracted me about this particular commemoration was that here we had, sitting at the same table, not only the Israeli ambassador, but also the ambassador of the UAE, of the United Arab Emirates.
Oh, okay.
First
because
time,
it just built a relationship.
Yes, because, and whatever the outcome of the presidential election might be in the United States, one of the legacies of the Trump administration will be that he was able to get these peace accords between Israel and the UAE, between Israel and Bahrain, between Israel and Sudan, where so many have tried and failed. For all these other potential or perceived faults, Donald Trump was able to cut through, and we were able to celebrate, or commemorate, I should say, Yitzhak Rabin's assassination with an ambassador from one of the Arab states. And I just think that is wonderful from the perspective of world peace, especially Middle East peace.
That sounds amazing. Like an Arab, a Jew, and you, a Nazi, together. Do you have a video of that?
Well, I've got a picture of it.
Can I see it?
Yes, of course. It's here, and it's next to a
that's the
portrait of Yitzhak Rabin that an Australian artist did, which is a very good likeness of Yitzhak Rabin, but it's something that I think is very historic, that you've got these two ambassadors sitting together, eating a meal, commemorating the assassination of a peace leader in the Middle East, and the sort of tags that people like to throw on me, of course, don't bear any resemblance to the fact. And why do people cast these sort of slurs? It's because they don't want to discuss the real issue.
Talking about Trump, so have you been watching the US election?
Yes, I have been, and look, given what was on offer, I make no apology for saying I am a Trump supporter. At the moment, as we're talking, far too close to call. One of them is going to fall over the line with a bare majority, one would assume, but that's the way democracy works, and whoever becomes the president will have a huge task ahead of them.
Because right now, the media says Trump is losing. What if Biden becomes the next president? You know, Australia and China now have this very, very awkward relation. Where are we going?
The American people and the Australian people have always had an exceptionally close relationship, and that was, I think, cemented by the United States helping Australia out in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which stopped Australia from being invaded by the Japanese imperialist forces, and that, I think, has brought the two countries together in, if you like, blood bonds that has seen Australia back the United States whenever needed, and similarly the United States backing Australia whenever needed. I don't see that changing. That said, I think President Trump would take a more robust approach to the communist dictatorship than Vice President Biden would, but time will tell to see how that plays out. That said, I think we will always have the friendship and support of the United States.
Yeah, but will Australian government change its position, facing China? And right now, China is banning lobster, banning red wines, and Australia we are still standing our ground. But if Biden got elected, will that change?
I don't think it will change because we believe in certain values and beliefs that are not negotiable. And so the dictatorship does become belligerent from time to time. And might I add, it's not only Australia that suffers this sort of belligerence from the dictatorship. When the Speaker of the Czech Parliament visited Taiwan, there was retribution on the Czech Republic. The Canadian Parliament's Human Rights Committee has just determined that which the dictatorship is doing to the Uyghur people is tantamount to genocide. And as a result, China is now, I understand, undertaking retaliatory action against Canada. And so that is why my view is, if all the freedom-loving countries of the world were to take a strong values-based approach to the dictatorship, supporting human rights, being unapologetic about that, ultimately the dictatorship will be isolated and will then need to reform itself and release the people that are in jail, the prisoners of conscience, the pro-democracy people, the Uyghurs from the concentration camps. So I would encourage the freedom-loving countries, and if it were President Biden or President Trump, to maintain the pressure on the basis of values and beliefs and fundamental human rights, so vitally important.
I know that economy is never your portfolio, but will that concern you if this kind of a boycott continues?
Well, of course it would, but why does China buy our goods? Only for one reason: quality, price, and there's a demand for them. So if they start banning our goods, they're actually cutting off their nose to spite their face. They're trying to punish us. In doing so, they are denying their own people the high quality Australian product that the Chinese people want to buy. And it is telling that they're not doing anything in relation to iron ore, because that is so vitally important to the Chinese economy. And so they are seeking softer targets within the Australian economy, but at the end of the day, Australian values should never be for sale. And that is where I believe you can honestly put economic interactions aside to the human rights discussions.